Christian Parenting.
Today's episode kicks off a 3-part series where we are going to dissect some specific personality traits and specific bents that some of our children may have. And we're going to talk about it in a way that is just kind of opening it up. Like, what does this actually look like? And then how, as a homeschool mom, can you support that child? Today, we're going to talk about homeschooling the fidgety and curious child without losing your patience. Now, when I wrote the title for this, I was like, is fidgety even a word? Yes, it is a word. And it can kind of often relate to maybe somebody who is more nervous and just in the way that they kind of fidget. But that's not specifically what I'm talking about. I'm not talking about any type of emotional regulation or deregulation, dysregulation, what's the word? But I'm just talking about the child who just kind of has to touch everything. Everything needs to be touched and moved and adjusted and played with. And the fact that I truly believe, and I've seen this, that those children that they seem fidgety, and that's just the word I'm going to use for it. It's not necessarily a negative thing. It just means that they are very involved, physically involved in their world. And how does that relate to curiosity? It's because they're so physically related into their world because they're curious about it. They're always looking for the reaction to something. I think a lot of these kids lean towards hands-on careers, possibly science, things that, like, if they're just kind of looking at something. And if I throw this ball at that, is it going to bounce this way, bounce that way? Is it going to break through that thing? They're thinking. And so they're going to touch that ball and they're going to throw that ball and they're possibly going to break something. They're going to be trying. They're going to not purposely mess up things, break things. And especially when they're younger, as they get older, we'll get into it, how you can be like, okay, we have to channel this into a good thing. But there's nothing necessarily wrong with a child that's going to be touching things and needs to just figure out how things work. And I think it's a beautiful thing when that just leads to curiosity. And I think the world is wide open for these children as they get older. And I know that as they're younger, it can sometimes really cause some impatience and some frustration. But I hope that today's episode gives you some hope, gives you just some practical tips on how to keep them in the right lane and keep them from possibly, burning down the house. No, not really. Yes, we don't want them to do that. We are going to keep them from doing that, but it's a good thing. It's a blessing. It's a gift that God's given. So let's dive into today's episode. Welcome to Little by Little Homeschool Podcast. I'm so glad you're here. I am your host, Leigh Nguyen. I am a mom towards the end of my homeschool career, and it is just so bittersweet. I am so blessed by the years of homeschooling, and I'm so glad for the foundation that it has given our children and the way that it has molded our family and just the many opportunities and just the relationship that it has forged with us. And that is why I share here at Little by Little Homeschool, and we share some tactical tips, but also just some more theoretical and always with a Christian bent, with a biblical worldview. And so welcome to today's episode. Before we get into the nitty-gritty, I want to give a disclaimer here. I'm not covering maybe some extreme behavior or possibly some ADHD. In my own experience, I don't feel that I am able to speak on that because I haven't done enough research, and that is not necessarily what has occurred within my home. So if that is the situation that you're dealing with, this might help you to a degree, but I encourage you to reach out and get some other resources from other people that are more experienced and more knowledgeable in that area. First, let me say that, as I mentioned just a moment ago, earlier, just that God gives gifts, talents, and abilities. And so when it comes to your fidgety and curious child, your job is to watch, to listen, to observe, and to encourage those gifts, talents, and abilities. The child that has to touch every single thing. Now, I am speaking to you from experience about this. My husband and I are like, really? Do we have to touch everything? And we always knew when this kiddo had been in a room, you could set something up or do something and things were just adjusted and changed, or sometimes just things would just not even thinking about what they were doing. Just, why did you tear up that paper? Oh, I don't know. I didn't really notice that I had done that. But everything had to be touched and examined and figured out. And that's where I think the curiosity comes. It is not typically from a malicious point of view. This fidgety and curious child is trying to understand the world. And the way that they best do that is with their hands and with experience. That is how they learn about the world. You can read them things, and yes, they will absorb that, and that will make sense, but you give them something to do. And so they're very kinesthetic learners. Again, it's not out of a malicious intent when maybe they mess something up. Their heart is not necessarily bent on doing anything. Sometimes they just don't even know that they did it because they just kind of absent-mindedly just were fidgeting with something and touching it and doing things and trying to figure out how things work. And so again, we need to channel this into good things, and we need to then have patience. Like, God, please give me patience with this child as I try to discover the gifts and talents and abilities and guide them into next steps. And I'm not saying that a job is the ultimate be all in a career, because we know that in nowadays, just because you start off with something doesn't mean you have to continue doing something. But these kids that are fidgety and that are very curious they're world changers. I mean, all of our kids are, but they're the ones that are really going to grasp things because they're willing to get to the nitty gritty and they're willing to get down and dirty to figure it out. With these kids, don't say things to them like, you're always messing things up. You're always breaking things. You're always insert negative comment, because that really starts to defeat them. After a while, they'll start to see this curiosity that God has given them and this ability to do things and manipulate things and to fix and adjust things with their hands. They're going to start to see like, oh, that's a negative thing, and I should just keep my hands to myself. And guess what? The world has missed out on some really cool things that this child could have fixed or invented. And so I know that it's hard in those moments when you just are walking from room to room and you see one more thing that is maybe messed up or turned around or built up or whatever it is. Listen, I've been there. And to say, okay, she is not doing this in a way that's trying to mess things up and trying to make my life more difficult. Now, there are times I'll be getting ready for a party or a gathering or something, say, you know what, the table is all set in a very specific way. If you could do me a favor and not make any adjustments to it. Don't touch the knives, don't touch the forks, don't flip the cups around, none of that. And maybe you include them in it and say, hey, why don't we figure out how to make the napkins into some kind of cool design, and you allow them to do that. That way they're taking part in it. They've been able to use that gift of using their hands and to fidgeting with things and how to do something, and that's their part. And then we step away and we just leave your fancy napkins and we let everybody see who's coming for this dinner party. But keep your frustrations to yourself and to your husband. But I do want to add that the more we negatively speak about maybe a frustration, specifically today's episode, about a child that's fidgety and touching things and moving things, when we are consistent in our speaking negatively, and when we can overdo this with our husband, it then creates a pattern. I've seen this in my own life. It creates a pattern, and then we approach this child in that way. And so if we can change those words around, and I'm not saying to be dishonest. There are times to be honest with ourselves. There's time to be honest with our husband, and maybe times to be honest with our child. But if we are so focused on the negativity, we're going to miss the actual good things, the positive side in it. And our brain will just be trained to see whatever thing they fidgeted with as a negative. Pray for a heart change. Pray for God to help you to see this child as He has created them to be. And only He can do that. So every day, maybe pray for a heart change. Help me, Lord, not to lose my cool, not to become impatient and frustrated with this child this day. Don't try to change your fidgety child, to make them somebody that they are not, because what that will do is they'll dull their curiosity. And sometimes that's a first clue that maybe you're pushing them too hard into a mold that they don't fit into. You start to notice that their curiosity begins to diminish. They're not asking as many questions. They're not as interested in learning about the world. And you might say, you know what? I might be trying to push them into a box, into a mold that they just don't fit into. And when you stop doing that, I pray and hope that you start to see that curiosity come back. Now, how can you specifically work through this? You've got some homeschool lessons to do. Maybe this child is the one that's sitting with a pencil and they're just flicking it, and it's just tap, 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 tap on the table. And you might have a sibling there, another one of your children, like, I can't do this work here with this. And they don't even hear it. They don't even notice that they are doing it. And so how can we keep their hands busy, which I think is a really good thing? During lessons, maybe there's something that they can be doing with their fingers. Maybe it's Play-Doh, maybe something that's quiet, something like Play-Doh, or maybe it is just cutting up some papers. There are so many different things, so many little gadgets and things that are quieter for them to do with their fingers, maybe while you're doing a lesson or during morning time. I always allowed my kids all the way up through high school. They had the choice. Now, when they were younger, I didn't necessarily give them a choice. It's like, go find something to do with your hands while we do morning time, because otherwise they would get bored and it just would kind of go downhill. But as they got older, and especially the teen years, I'm like, if you don't want to do something with your hands, you don't have to. My rule during morning time, though, was that they couldn't do any type of reading or writing while I was reading to them for our family learning and our morning time. Because if they're reading, they're not listening to me read. If they're writing, they're not absorbing what I am reading. But they could do other things. They could color, they could draw, they could, for many years, my boys would work on a Rubik's Cube, some type of little puzzle, or maybe you can actually even just put a puzzle out to something that their brain can do just without having to think a lot. Now, maybe an actual puzzle might make them focus too much on that and not necessarily on what you are reading and the lessons that you're doing. So you're going to kind of have to test, like, what are your parameters? What are the things that they can do and the things that they can't do while you're doing lessons and while you're doing maybe morning time and reading to them. And so you give them things. It's not a bad thing to give them things, because oftentimes you will maybe hear, especially as a fidgety child gets older, you'll hear from them. They might actually say, you know what, I listen better if my hands are doing something. Maybe they want to learn how to knit, or they want to learn how to crochet, and they get to the point where they don't really have to think much about it. So really, it's those types of things that they don't have to think much about, but that they can kind of just do. And it isn't necessarily a distraction for everybody. Building with Legos. My boys did that for many years. My daughter would join in too. There was one rule, though. The bin of Legos that came in, they weren't allowed to take their hands and swoosh, swoosh, swoosh it from side to side, because it was so loud. So oftentimes they would take it and just dump out a bunch of pieces onto the rug so that they could easily see all the pieces and not be rifling and digging through. Because when you're trying to read a book, that sound is actually very loud. Now, as they get older, it is good for them to learn that it's okay and it's actually proper, and it's a good asset for them to know how to just be still at times. If they're going in for an interview, we can't bring Play-Doh into an interview when they're 16 years old and play with Play-Doh while we are going through the interview. No, there's times that we just need to sit still and we just need to do the thing that is in front of us. So as they get older, we just teach them how to do that, and you can start to lengthen that amount of time that they're actually just there doing something and don't necessarily have to have some mindless thing to be doing with their hands. As far as the curiousness, don't crush their curiousness. And I mentioned earlier that sometimes we don't know that we are until we start to notice that curiousness, that curiosity isn't around as much. Now, we can't always answer every single question that comes up. I remember there was so many questions that would always come up. I mean, with all of my kids, but especially with the fidgety, curious ones, like questions that I wouldn't even think of. Me, as a 40-some-year-old mom, homeschooling this child, like, I have no idea. I've really not thought of that. And that's okay to say to them, like, wow, your brain, like, you think of some really great questions. I've never thought of that. And now you've got me thinking and wondering about that too. And then say, okay, let's look into it. And maybe there's times that you can't. Maybe there's times where you're like, okay, We don't have the time in the middle of dinner, and you don't give this child free access to the internet, so they can't go ahead and look up the question that they have. So, you know what, can you do me a favor and write that down? Or you scribble it down or put it in the notes on your phone and say, we will get back to that, because I want to know the answer too. And I want you to know the answer. For kids that are curious, they have questions, they want to know something, they want to know maybe how something works, and maybe they just want to know something because they're trying to make a connection in their brain between something else. And maybe if they're not making that connection, they just want some foundation, and later on, some connections are going to be made to that thing. And no, you are not a failure as a mom or a homeschool mom if you don't get to all of the questions that they ask. So it's okay then to say, I don't know the answer. Can we get back to that a little bit later? I love that you have that question. And sometimes they're going to ask questions that we don't know if we're really quite prepared to answer and how to answer those, and say, you know what? I would love to have that conversation. Can we have that conversation just a little bit later? Give them access to tons of books. So go to the library, stock up on books, purchase books, borrow books from friends, and just let them pour over those books. Their curiosity sometimes doesn't have to be something specific. Maybe, sometimes they're like, oh, they're really interested in hot air balloons. Well, maybe you don't have any hot air balloon books. Find something about frogs. Let them become curious about that, and then get the hot air balloon books some other time. And just because they're curious about hot air balloons does not mean that they are someday going to purchase a hot air balloon. They just want to know, how does it work? And maybe someday they will purchase a hot air balloon. But as they get older, one thing that I have found really works well for curious kids is to give them more and more of their education to themselves, putting it into their hands and feeding their curiosity, and giving them access to resources and maybe to people. And for the fidgeters, giving them access to things that they can fidget with, that they can take apart. People will say, so this is the fidgety curious one is my youngest, and I will share on Instagram some of the things that they're doing. And recently, I was showing he was doing some automotive repair. And someone asked, well, how did you get him to learn this? Listen, he's always been curious. He's always been taking things apart, and he's my tech guy now. And he's how do you fix this? And even my husband will be like, can you fix this? Like, we all ask him to fix things. And because he has enough experience with, even if it's something completely different, he's like, I have enough experience in this, so I can kind of figure out this. And he makes those connections and put those things together. It started off with just very simple little things, and just things like, so my older son, I remember being like, oh, we have to get him all those little kits, those little science kits with like the circuit boards and all that kind of stuff. He did not care about it at all. It sat around in the box, and he never really played with it. His little brother starts to get older and was really curious about it. I was like, well, here you go. Your older brother wasn't really interested in it. And so he just it's just by doing things, by trying things, and just giving him access. I remember one time coming home from my parents' house, and they had given me a box full of old like answer machines and telephones and radios. And he just spent hours and days just taking those things apart, and sometimes putting it back together, and sometimes it didn't work. But for those fidgety kids, being able to just kind of do that, he would work on some of those things while I would do lessons with him, while we would do our family learning together. And so giving them just more of their own education into their own hands. And it's not always the book work. It can often, a lot of times, be the hands-on things that they want to do, and giving them those opportunities. If you didn't quite catch on to this yet, but the kids that are fidgety, they are hands-on learners. And so please give them opportunities. Maybe it is a opportunity for a library program. We did a couple of years ago, there was a library program. They had gotten a grant, and he built a computer with the class. And if you attended all 4 of those classes, you got to bring the computer home. I think it started off with maybe 15 kids. And I think he was like one of maybe 4 that came to all of them. And so he was able to bring this computer home. But he knew already, just even though he hadn't built a computer yet, he knew the next steps of what to do and why. And so these kids are the kids that they want to know more than just that it works. They want to know how it works. And so with our kids that are a little bit more fidgety, the ones that then leads to them probably being a more curious child. They are going to teach you more than you even knew existed in the world. So this automotive project, I've been helping him with it. I was like, I'll be your gopher. I'll get the tools. I'll get this. I'll get that. And I will help you out. I'll be your assistant. He's like, well, I work best alone. I'm like, that's fine. I'll just be assistant. I'm not actually going to help you with anything, like hold things, pick things up. Like that's it. I don't know what else, but I've learned a lot about a car. And here I am, 50 years old. These homeschool children that seem to be just fidgety, and we just can become really impatient about it because they're like, can you just leave that alone? They grow into curious children that are really problem solvers, and they are really people that want to know how things work. And they often, you'll find that they're really good at explaining it and telling you, and they are excited about these things. So I hope that if you have a fidgety and curious child, that this episode has encouraged you. The next 2 episodes are going to be about some specific other very different types of personalities and bents for children. If you enjoy this podcast, I thank you very much for listening. And if you would like to have me pop into your inbox once a week, I send out in a newsletter and just kind of gives you a little bit more of an encouragement when it comes to homeschooling. And I'd love to be able to say hello to you in your email inbox. You can go ahead and sign up for that newsletter with the link in the show notes. Until next time, have a great day.